the sign says, Capharnaum, the town of Jesus. And we know that after leaving Nazareth, this is where Jesus came to. He came to Capernaum and he lived and stayed at Capernaum. And he took it as the headquarters of his ministry in Galilee. For different reasons. One of them is the strategic location of Capernaum. If you remember the two roads that connected Egypt with Asia Minor, both of them passed by the town of Capernaum, the Via Maris and the Patriarch's Highway. They both passed by the town of Capernaum, besides the one that connected the Mediterranean with what we call the Decapolis. So it was an important crossroad. And so for Jesus, this was like a really perfect place for his message to be carried by those travelers from one place to another place. And that's why he chose Capernaum to be the headquarters of his ministry in Galilee. According to Matthew, Matthew tells us that while in Galilee, Jesus spent most of his times at three places, three towns. Capernaum, do you know the other two towns? Chorazim, which is northwest, and Bethsaida, which is northeast. If you look on the maps, your maps, you'll see how the three cities make a shape of a triangle. And nowadays we call it the evangelical triangle or the holy triangle, because that's where Jesus spent most of his times teaching at the synagogues of these three towns. But we know that by the end of his ministry, he kind of cursed these three towns and he prophesied their destruction because of the lack of faith of the people who witnessed his miracles. He was at Capernaum when he said, "Woe to you, Capernaum, if the mighty works that have been done to you have been done to Sodom and Gomorrah, they would have lasted till today." Because we know from the Gospels that so many miracles of Jesus took place over here, right at Capernaum where we are sitting. We know for sure that this is the first century town of Capernaum. Almost everything you see over here goes back to the time of Jesus. This is the first century town of Capernaum. I'm going to tell you about three miracles that happened over here, because you can see things directly related to them. The first one is the synagogue that you see over here. If you look at the synagogue was built by the white stones. Now what's the miracle related to it? Who built this synagogue? Anybody knows? It's unique and it's in the Gospels, Luke chapter 7. The Roman centurion. And what did Jesus do to him? Healed his servant. Jesus healed his servant. When Jesus was coming out from the synagogue, the Roman centurion came to him. And he was like, "Lord, please help me. My servant is dying." And Jesus was like, "Okay, let's go to your house." And the Roman centurion said, "You know what? You don't have to come to my house. I'm not worthy that you come to my house. I believe that if you just say the word, my servant will be cured." He had great faith, great belief in Jesus. And so when he said that, the inhabitants of Capernaum came to him and they were like, "Please, sir, help him. He is so good to us. He built our synagogue." Because if you look on the other side, in front of the synagogue, you'll get to see a church. That's a new church. Again, was built in an octagonal shape. But that church was built on top of one of the houses of Capernaum that you will get to see underneath the church. Again, it's surrounded by an octagonal wall. That house was identified as the house of Peter. And what did Jesus do to him here? Healed his mother-in-law. That's where Jesus healed his mother-in-law. That house that you will get to see underneath the church was identified as the house where Jesus lived at while at Capernaum. The same house where he healed Peter's mother-in-law. Now, where was Peter from? The name of the town. He was not from Capernaum. He lived here, but he was not from Capernaum. He was from Bethsaida. Where is Bethsaida in relation to here? Northeast. 30 minutes walk from here. What made him come and live at Capernaum? Fishing. You remember the hot springs? So Peter was a fisherman. So what he did every day, he walked from Bethsaida through the town of Capernaum to go to the northern shores to fish by the seven springs, continue all the way to Magdala, sell the fish at Magdala, and then walk all the way back to Bethsaida. Is between the synagogue and the church, you will get to see a square area. You'll get to see a lot of rooms attached to each other, just like here. Actually, this is another, what we call insula. Insula was the way of building the houses back at that time. Now, technically, every room you see over here is a house, is a family. You might think that it's a big community center or a big villa with a lot of rooms and houses. No, every house, every room is a house. And people back at that time built their houses attached to each other. In most of the cases, 4 or 5 families would share one entrance, which is still part of our culture nowadays. You see a lot of 4 and 5 stories buildings. That would be one family that live there. Those are not apartments, most of them. And they would share one entrance. In many cases back at that time, if you wanted to go outside your house, you had to walk through your neighbor's house. That was so common back at that time in that culture. Simply because people felt more safe, especially that they lived under the Roman occupation. So they felt more safe to live together. They could support and help each other. We always read about the man who was lowered down from the roof of the house. Now, when you understand the insula, you will understand why the man was lowered down. Because if you imagine Jesus sitting in one of those houses and people are gathering around him, even outside the house, it was impossible for the guys carrying the sick person to make their way through the crowds and the narrow alleys and the low doors and bring the man in front of Jesus. It was much easier for them to go to the roof of the house. Because the roofs of the houses back at that time, over here at Capernaum, were made out of 3 layers. 2 layers of reeds, and in between 1 layer of dry mud to absorb the rainwaters. It was not really a strong roof. So they went to the roof of that house where Jesus was sitting. They removed the reeds and the mud, and they lowered the man in front of him instead of trying to make their way through the crowds and bring him in front of Jesus. So when you see the insula over there or over here, you will get to understand why the man was lowered down. Besides so many other miracles that happened over here, not only these 3. If you read the Gospels, there are so many miracles that happened at Capernaum. One of them is like when Jesus was sitting at Peter's house, and the teachers of the law came to Peter, and they were like teasing him. Did your master pay the temple tax? And what did Jesus tell him? We did, but you know what? Do not bother arguing with him. Go down to the shores over there and throw your line in the lake. Take the first fish you catch, and you will get what? You will find what? A coin. Give it to them. That's enough for you and me to pay the temple tax, which is this is type of coin. This is what I'm wearing. This is the shekel. This is the shekel of Tyre, which was the temple tax. It had the face of milk art on it, the god of Tyre, and the eagle, which is the emblem of the Roman Empire. This is 1 shekel. The temple tax back at that time, according to Exodus, was half shekel. That the weight of it back at that time was 13.5 grams. It had to be the 13.5 grams. It was the only money that the temple authority in Jerusalem took or accepted as a temple tax, simply because it was the only one that was made out of pure silver. And a month before the Passover, we know that money changers. Why do you need money changers in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem? Because people who came from different places used different types of coins of money, but they couldn't use that money in Jerusalem. They had to change into the temple money. And so they went to the money changers, they changed into the temple money, and they paid the temple tax, and they went up to the temple. So a month before the Passover, we know that they brought thousands of these coins from Tyre. And money changers were at all the junctions leading to Jerusalem, changing money for those Jewish pilgrims going to Jerusalem. So the temple tax was half shekel. When Jesus told Peter, you will find a coin in the fish mouth, he was talking about the 1 shekel, because the 1 shekel was enough to pay the temple tax for both of them. So it happened at Capernaum. Besides so many other miracles. But by the end of his ministry, he prophesied the destruction of the town of Capernaum that was fulfilled in the year 363 by an earthquake in Galilee that destroyed Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin. The 3 cities that Jesus prophesied their destruction in Matthew. Caesarea Philippi, which is 25 miles north from here, at the foot of Mount Hermon, which is the highest mountain in Israel. What you need to know is that Caesarea Philippi, for the Jews in the 1st century, was like a sin city. They couldn't go to Caesarea Philippi, simply because Caesarea Philippi was one of the biggest centers of the pagan worship. That's where people worshipped the god Pan, the god of the shepherds. And they believed that the god Pan lived in hell, in the underworld, in Hades. And at the foot of Mount Hermon, there is a big cave. The water back at that time, which is the source of the Jordan, gushed out from the cave. And so they believed that that cave is the gates of hell, the gates to Hades. And so since the god Pan lives there, they built a temple in front of that cave, and they used to go and sacrifice animal sacrifices for the god Pan. The habit was to bring the animal, walk through the temple. At the back of the temple, they could see the cave. They threw the animal inside the cave, and they ran outside to look at the water. If they saw blood in the water, that means that the god Pan did not accept their sacrifice. They'll go to the market, buy another sacrifice, walk through the temple, throw the animal inside the cave, run outside. If there was no blood in the water, it means that the god Pan swallowed their sacrifice and he is satisfied. That was strongly practiced at the same time when Jesus had his ministry over here. When he was feeding people and healing them and raising them from the dead, people still went to that place and worshiped the god Pan. So only a few weeks before he goes to Jerusalem to die, Jesus decided to take his disciples, those Jewish disciples, and he walked from here all the way to that sin city, to that pagan place. And he stood in front of that cave. And he made a very simple question to his disciples. Who do people say I am? And then they started to give him different answers. Some say John the Baptist, or the prophet Elijah, or Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. And Jesus was like, well, stop it, guys. You know what? I don't care what people say about me. Who do you say the Son of Man is? And who was the one that answered him? Peter, the one who denied him later in Jerusalem. And he was like, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, not the son of these dead stones that people come to worship. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And what did Jesus tell him? Peter, you are the rock. On this rock, I will build my church. That's where Jesus established the church, at the pagan city of Caesarea Philippi. And he established that church on that foundation stone, which is Peter. Just like in the Old Testament, when God sent Noah to build the ark that would provide protection and salvation from the waters of the flood for whoever goes into that ark. Now in the New Testament we have Jesus that built a church that would provide the same thing, protection and salvation for whoever goes into that church. And he found a church on that foundation stone, which is Peter. So Peter, you are the rock. On this rock I will build my church. What was the next phrase? And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Why did he say so? That's where he was standing. He was standing in front of people, what people believed to be the gates of hell. You are the rock, Peter. I will build my church on this rock, and these gates shall not prevail against it. 6 days after that, or 8 days after that, according to Luke, the transfiguration happened. That transfiguration was another sign for the disciples that this is the new Israel. This is the new Exodus. This is the Son of God. This is the one that must be sacrificed in Jerusalem. The entrance of the synagogue. I'm going to show you the seat of Moses as we walk up from the synagogue. That's where the rabbis sat on to get authority from that seat to teach. We know the Lord didn't need that. He didn't need the authority from that seat. And that's why in John chapter 6, when he gave them the bread of life discourse, he did not go and sit at the seat of Moses. He came, it says clearly, he came and sat between them in their midst, because he did not need that authority from that seat to teach. But for the Jewish rabbis, the teachers of the law, when they wanted to teach, they had to sit on the seat of Moses. And this is what happened in Nazareth. Most probably, that's where Jesus sat down. But here at Capernaum, he did not. Because he did not need that seat to get authority to teach. So it happened exactly where we are. Beginning. But here he started to change the focus of the Passover lamb from the meat of the lamb or the body of the lamb into his own body as the Lamb of God. This is where he started that. And he finished it at the upper room in Jerusalem when he took the cup and he said, this is the new covenant. This is my blood that will be poured for many. And we will get to talk about this when we go to Jerusalem to the upper room. But this is where he started that, the bread of life discourse, exactly where you are sitting. And there is no doubt about it. Okay? Okay, so I'm saying that this is the seat of Moses. See the armrest, the seat, there was another armrest over here. So this existed at every synagogue by the main entrance. So when that grown-up male read from the Torah or the four major Jewish prophets, he stood in front of or in the middle of the synagogue. Then he had to come over here, sit down, get authority from this seat of Moses to teach the Torah or the prophecies. But as I told you, if you read John chapter 6, Jesus did not need at the synagogue over here at Capernaum to sit on this seat. After he said that, he came and sat in the middle of the people. At a lot of places, they would have a big room in the middle. That's where all the women of these, the estimated number of people who lived in this square area is 100, average 17 families at this square area that you see. So usually they'll have a big room in the middle, at the center, where all the women would gather, and usually they'll make food for everybody. All the women would work together and share everything. So this is an insula, and you can see how hard was it for the guys carrying the sick person to walk through these alleys and the low doors and the steps and the crowds and bring the man in front of Jesus.